So when you were told, well, you kind of should know who we are in the introduction, the group that I work with, JPAL at MIT, is a network of researchers around the world, so more than 140 researchers around the world who do the careful kind of evidence-based research assessing the effectiveness of programs that Stefan was talking about, and in particular use randomized trials. So if, for example, you've ever been on GiveWell's site and looked at the charities that they recommend, I think it's the case that every single one of them, those recommendations are based on the research done by the network of academics in our. So we're sometimes in the background, but that's a lot of that evidence is then used to assess whether things are effective. But let me talk a bit about microcredit. So you've got inspiring comments on your tables, but here are some more. You know, small business is the backbone of America. All human beings are born entrepreneurs, and only some get the chance to unleash it. And then, you know, comments from Mohammed Yunus about how this doesn't only just lead to improvements in income, but changes people's sense of confidence and empowerment, and particularly the story is made for women, putting women in the driving seat. So I want to just go through, so we're all on board on what is microcredit, before I start to talk about what's the evidence on it. Move away from this. No, that makes it even worse. Okay. So the idea is you give people access to inputs, to credit, and that allows them to start a business. That increases their business activity, or if they have got a business already, it increases their business activity. That increases household income. People spend that on education and health, and you get, you know, better health, better social outcomes, more empowered women. So that's the theory of change for microcredit. I think it's also important to say kind of a bit more about the mechanics. So what's the innovation? If you think of that, you know, why did microcredit start a few decades ago, and what was different about microcredit to regular credit? Well, the idea was that a lot of the poor don't have assets that they can have as collateral for borrowing, but they still have need for credit. And so how do you give to these people? Well, you kind of leverage the social knowledge in the community by having groups of usually women borrow together, and they would kind of know they would form groups with people that they trusted, and they would kind of look over each other's shoulders so that you had this bond of trust, and therefore people would repay because of these social networks. And another innovation was the idea of giving very small loans and having people repay them almost immediately. So they start repaying them within a couple of weeks usually, and make small weekly payments. So, and this model was successful in that you get very high repayment rates. Figuring out what the impact of introducing this innovation is actually quite hard. And the reason it's quite hard is because the kinds of people who take up microcredit tend to be different from the people who don't. So imagine a situation in a community where women are very under-empowered, and they find it very, they may not have much freedom to leave the house often. They can't, buy things. I do a lot of work on women's empowerment in Bangladesh. Women's mobility is very, very restricted. Obviously, Bangladesh is one of the places that microcredit started. Now, if you offer a credit product in that environment, the kind of women who put themselves forward to take it up are going to be different from the women who don't. So until relatively recently, all the research talking about the impact of microcredit compared women who borrow to women who don't borrow. And the women who were borrowing were doing better in all sorts of dimensions. They were more empowered, they sent their kids to school more, they had higher income, they had higher education. And the mistake was to assume that that was because of microcredit rather than it was because they were empowered and educated and whatever that they felt able to take up this opportunity. So disentangling correlation and causation is quite hard, and I think microcredit is a good example of that. So what do? Well, you randomize. You take the group, just like we do for medicine, you take a group of people and you randomly offer some the credit and some not the credit. Now, not everyone's going to take it up amongst those who are offered it, but you compare the group that was offered microcredit to the group that wasn't. And this is what we started to do. So in a number of countries around the world, we did these randomized evaluations of microcredit. And the first thing that's quite interesting is a lot of people don't want it, right? We have this kind of rule of thumb, which is if you go talk to a microcredit organization, at least this used to be the case, they will tell you that 80% of people who are eligible will take it up, and actually it's less than 20%. Like, it's extraordinary how often, how really off they are. Because they just see women coming to their door and they don't actually count the number of women who could go, right? So, Ethiopia was quite high, 31%, but Morocco, only 13% of the people who are eligible for microcredit took it up. So that's kind of interesting. It suggests that people actually do have other sources of credit that they can go to. Interestingly, people often prefer money lenders because it's a more flexible arrangement than microcredit. Now, this is summarizing a huge number of years of research in one table. But these are all the countries in which there was a randomized control trial of credit programs. So, really across the map: Bosnia, Herzegovina, Mongolia, Morocco, Philippines, Mexico, India. So I was involved in the one in India. And then a whole range of different outcomes that people think of as being, should be helped by microcredit. So 2 of the cases, there was more business ownership, but not in the rest. 2 of the cases, there was an increase in business revenue. Maybe there was more inventory. People had more inventory in stock. So kind of basically on the business side, there was some improvement in business activity. And, if you take one of those indicators of business activity, most of them had some indicator, but not on profits. Now, profits are hard to measure, but nothing on household income. Like, nobody found higher household income as a result of there being access to microcredit. So that story in terms of relieving poverty doesn't seem to be happening. And, again, on consumption and spending, and again, on measures of social well-being, so nobody's found an increase in women's decision-making power or empowerment or any of these kind of social things that people really hope were going to change because of microcredit. So, what do I take from all of this? I don't think microcredit's a bad thing. I think credit is something that's useful for people. And a lot of times you see people are smoothing or actually using it to save. But it's not a solution to poverty. Like, it's a useful, potentially useful thing, but it's not kind of this big silver bullet. It's not doing all the things that people were claiming. And I think this is a chart that kind of helps explain a little bit about what's going on. This is the proportion of firms that are, that have 1 person, 4 people, up to 1,000 people. And you see the distribution is so different between poor countries and richer countries. And these countries where microcredit is offered already have a huge number of really small firms. And that's kind of what microcredit normally does. It helps people run a business of themselves. And that's really not what's lacking in these economies. There are a lot of really small firms. What you're not seeing is kind of these bigger firms. So I think this sort of starts getting to the fundamental reason why this story of you know, the lack of credit was stopping people starting firms. Well, not really. Like, the amazing thing about these countries is everybody is trying to be an entrepreneur. They're mainly trying to be an entrepreneur because they don't have a choice. They prefer a job. If you ask them, they'd all prefer a job. I think the challenge is, how do you get big firms to expand, to offer the jobs? I mean, you guys are entrepreneurs. You know that it's not the job that everybody, like, not everyone is good at being an entrepreneur. And I think that's kind of the message, one of the fundamental messages of the lack of success of microcredit is that's not necessarily where everyone wants to go. Thanks.